Hi, my name is David Bruce. So I put out a call for questions on Twitter and Instagram and here on the channel, as well as to my patrons over at Patreon. And I must say I had some really great questions. I'm just sorry I don't have time to answer all of them. So let's jump straight in. Patron Jeremy Abel asks, how do you think generative or algorithmic composition fits into today's musical landscape? I'm not too familiar with the current scene, but I'm a big fan of the composer Tristan Perich, whose music is often either entirely programmatically generated or is a combination of performed music and generated music. So Tristan Perich's work sits in a place that seems quite close to the conceptual art world, and in fact some of his works have been displayed in art galleries. One of his best known works is called Microtonal Wall, which features a wall of speakers each fractionally higher than the next. So as you move around it, the sound gradually changes. It's a fun idea. Another example I liked was called 1-bit music and then 1-bit symphony, both of which use a simple computer chip built into a CD case, which then generates the music each time you listen. Perich's music, from what I've heard of it, seems to fit broadly into what's sometimes called post-minimalism. And many of these post-minimalist composers either use computer algorithms to help them compose, or if not, they sound like they do. Take David Lang, for example. He doesn't use computers, but his music often sounds algorithmic. In fact, he's actually talked about how he spent 8 months deriving the algorithm for one piece. So I think it's fair to say that in some cases at least, he creates a kind of code and then applies it to his materials to generate a piece. Here's his piece for violin and piano, Light Moving, which I really like. And you can hear very gradual changes going on. Mostly they don't sound something that a human would have instinctively done. They sound more like this kind of generative approach. A lot of Lang's pieces don't change very fast. He said, "When I listen to Beethoven, the emotional trajectory is incredibly erratic. That's not an emotional life I want. I like to remain in more or less one state." People who don't like my music say there's not enough to listen to. And those who do like it hear something evolving over a long distance. So I think it's fair to say that Tristan Perich would sit comfortably within this school of music which sometimes generates its material, if not from computers directly, then from a sort of more programmatic type of composing. Boy Meets Bot asks a couple of great questions. Now I realise that answering them both isn't really fair, but I felt like they were interesting questions and I could give useful answers to both. So, when writing non-functional or atonal harmonies, what considerations affect your note choices? Do you work either entirely by ear or do you rely on some other system to guide you? So I haven't managed to find an overall system of harmony that I could use in any situation. A bit like Stravinsky's approach, which I talked about in a recent video, I tend to have various techniques which I apply to different situations. One thing I have found is that it's almost impossible for me to write purely atonal music that doesn't have a tonal centre. Especially when I was a student, I found some of my attempts at writing more modernist pieces always ended up having some kind of tonal centre hidden within them, even if I hadn't intended it. So there are two ways you can tackle harmony, vertically or horizontally. So functional harmony, which is basically thinking of chords in terms of tonic, dominant, subdominant and so on, is one example of vertical harmony. You're thinking in chords and you're filling in those chords with horizontal lines that move between them. This is how most classical music since Bach's time onwards has worked, at least until the 20th century. Even composers like Debussy, who start to move beyond the traditional functional ways of moving, still spend most of their time thinking in chords, thinking vertically. So how do those chords relate to each other if they're no longer functional in the traditional sense? One approach I try to take is to try to think in terms of the physics of sound and the audible connections that the ear is able to make. So I think the ear is able to detect a connection between harmonies that move by step, harmonies that move by a fifth because of the overtone series, harmonies where something stays the same and something else changes, and harmonies which deliberately avoid any of the above. And in a way that covers all the options you have. In Ligeti's second piano etude, for example, you can see how most of the harmonic movement is either through fifths or through stepwise movement. So it's a great example of how you can use these two techniques to guide the ear without having to rely on functional harmony. Now the other way to think is horizontally. This is essentially modal harmony, so the individual chords are less important. What's important is that all the notes played come from one particular collection of notes, one mode. Here's an example from John Adams's opera The Flowering Tree, where the entire section just uses notes from this mode.
close to the river. An old woman, weary, fretted, lived alone.
It's easy, actually it's tempting, to allow yourself to be straitjacketed into one or other of these approaches. So I'm in this mode, so I need to use these notes. But we saw a very clear example of a more nuanced approach in my flamenco video. Music that's influenced by the chord progressions of the Andalusian cadence, as well as the conflicting mode of the Phrygian scale used in the melody. And that shows you a way that vertical chords and horizontal modes can interact, even if they somewhat contradict each other. And I think it's working out an effective way of using and handling this contradiction, this uncertainty, that's one of the main areas I'm trying to think about more at the moment. So here's Boy Meets Bot's second question. Why is there so little melody in contemporary classical music? Most composers now seem to work more with repeating and developing short motives than full melodic statements. This is a massive and fascinating question which I doubt I can do justice to here. So I think we should be careful with our definitions here. I mean, I think the type of melody that your question implies is going to be one that is memorable, possibly singable, and built out of phrases, possibly with some repetitions. And I think in that sense, your assertion is definitely correct. There are very few composers currently operating in contemporary classical music who would write that kind of melody. The reason relates to the kind of piece you're trying to write, both in terms of its length and its purpose. A fully developed melody is essentially a sort of song, and there are many types of music you might want to write that aren't song. A sort of symphonic writing that develops ideas and plays around with them is of course one of the main modes of expression in Western music, and there's a long tradition of using short phrases as a way of building large pieces. Whereas if you have a long melody, short of repeating it, it's much harder to create a sense of coherence out of something that in itself will no doubt have quite a bit of variety and contrast. Not impossible, of course. There are many pieces by, say, Beethoven or Brahms that have both a tight sense of coherence but also long, expansive melodies. But as a general rule, if you want your music to sound like it's bound by this rigorous logic and intellectual integrity, you'll tend to write very short, fragmented themes instead of broader melodies. This is not to say that one way is better than the other, just that there are different approaches to writing music. Other approaches might, for example, draw on ways of building music that are found in other parts of the world. Indian music, for example, is very much a lyrical tradition, but you wouldn't say it has melodies in the way that your question implies. Instead, it builds long lines out of individual ragas, which are more than just scales, they're like collections of ways of moving around a scale. So in summary, to create a melody which is memorable, which has phrases, repetitions, and a sense of overall shape, is to work within one very specific kind of tradition and one specific way of music making. And although it doesn't always seem like it if you turn on the radio, there are actually many other types of music making, approaches to music that people want to make. And a lot of those types can be found in contemporary classical composition. Victor29RC says, "How can I leave my ego out of my compositions? I like weird music, but I don't want to force anything. Even though I try to hear everything before I write it, sometimes I get kind of insecure with the result. Cheers from Brazil." Now, the idea of your ego in your composition relates strongly to the idea of why you do it and who you do it for. I sometimes write pieces which are pure fun, and then I worry that they'll be looked down on by some groups of people. And other times I write much more concept-driven, nerdy pieces, which I then worry will just come across as academic navel-gazing. I actually feel like I've made some progress in this area through the whole process of starting a YouTube channel. I'm naturally pretty reserved and introverted, so the whole process of speaking to a camera and having a strong position on the range of topics I've talked about, as well as settling on a presenting style, all of this is filled with a similar range of choices. Who am I aiming these at? Is it just for my own ego? And early on I came to the realization that some people I might have in mind who might look down on my lighter or sillier videos and compositions, well, they'll think what they're going to think anyway. They certainly won't admire me anymore if I attempt to pander to what I think they'd like. So the realization that anyone who's predisposed to dislike what I do will do so either way, and anyone predisposed to be friendly to me will probably continue to do so. So that felt like it freed me up to just do what I wanted to do. And the strange thing I've learned so far on YouTube is that the more nerdy I get, the more people seem to appreciate it. Who would have thought that a video on microrhythms would be one of my biggest hits? So that has reminded me just to continue just finding things that I love or I'm excited by, and trust that other people will do the same. Andy Noah asks, what is your favourite music genre that is not classical, e.g. rock, hip-hop, electronic, etc.? And what is your favourite album that's part of that genre? So, speaking of being scared of what people think, I'm definitely conscious as I answer this that I'll no doubt turn off a bunch of people with my choices, whatever they are. But in the spirit of attempting to not give a shit, my tastes tend towards funk. I was a big fan of early Brand New Heavies. Their album Heavy Rhyme Experience Volume 2 was a big favourite, along with their initial B&H album. This kind of instrumental funk or jazz funk. In fact, the use of sort of funky sleigh bells on one of their tracks inspired me to use them in my piece Grownbox.
Some think that I'm a flake, but I'm no fake,
I grew up on Prince, who was my first musical passion, although it saddens me to say I don't feel like many of his songs have aged as well as, say, some of Michael Jackson's. Who else? Miles Davis, Bitches Brew, Kind of Blue, of course. But I do also have a love of folk guitar, early Bob Dylan, Joni Mitchell. There's a YouTube channel I support on Patreon, Josh Turner Guitar, who does a lot of covers in finger-picking guitar style. I just love every track he puts out. I often find it very moving. And I recently went to see Hades Town, which was written by Anais Mitchell, and there's some beautiful songs by her you can find on YouTube. One of my all-time favourite albums is an Indian album called Call of the Valley, and it's a bit embarrassing because amongst most Indian musicians I've spoken to, it's seen as a sort of westernified, touristy kind of album. But there's no doubt it contains some master musicians, including the great Hari Prasad Chaurasia on the Bansuri flute, and I find the sort of tone colour of the entire album intoxicating and deeply meditative. In fact, we used to play it to our kids to put them in a restful mood in the car, where somehow it became known as tiger music. Aww. The Addict of Gaming asks, how does the influence of modern day life affect your composition? So this is another really interesting topic, and there's obviously loads to say, more than we've got space for here. There are obviously the sounds of the modern world, machinery, the bustle of the city, which composers have been imitating for a century or more. But more profoundly, there are ways of perceiving the world that have emerged, the ability to move at speed, to fly, the effect, say, of a train going suddenly into a tunnel. All of these kind of sensations inevitably filter through into music. And then there's the changes in perception that film and television have brought with them, the jump cut, the transition, the fact that you can perceive two realities at once, the one that you're watching on the screen and the one that's in the room you're sitting in. All of these have had more subtle effects on how we perceive time and how we perceive our sense of place, and I'm sure they've had a direct impact on compositions. I haven't even got on to recording and YouTube and the massive availability of all music from all over the world, of course. All of this is stuff I think we'll have to return to another time. So that'll have to do for now. I really appreciate you watching. Thank you for all your questions, and thank you to my patrons as usual for your wonderful support of the channel. If you're not already, do please consider subscribing, and I'll see you next time.